The darkness inside the farmhouse was not cool, as it usually was before dawn. Instead, the air felt thick and heavy, trapped within the plaster walls like a held breath. Elam Yutzy opened his eyes, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling that he could not see, but knew were there by heart. Beside him, the rhythm of his wife Sarah's breathing was shallow. Even in sleep, she seemed aware of the heat that had settled over Holmes County like a heavy wool blanket. Elam sat up slowly, the old corn husk mattress rustling beneath his weight. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the smooth, wide-planked floorboards. There was no hum of a refrigerator, no blinking lights of digital clocks. Only the absolute silence of the country. He reached for his trousers, hanging on the wooden peg by the door, and dressed in the dark. It was a skill learned from childhood, a muscle memory that required no light. He found his suspenders, pulling them over his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle against his back. Today would be another day of relentless sun. He could feel it in the stillness of the air. Elam moved to the wash basin in the corner of the room. He poured water from the pitcher, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet room. The water was lukewarm, having lost its chill hours ago. He splashed his face, the water running into his beard, but it offered little relief. He dried himself with a rough linen towel, pausing to look out the window. Outside, the world was painted in shades of charcoal and indigo. The moon was a sliver, offering little light to the sleeping fields. But Elam knew what was out there. He knew the corn was not standing as tall as it should. He knew the earth was cracking in spiderweb patterns between the rows. He picked up the lantern, but decided not to light it yet. He walked down the narrow stairs, the wood groaning softly under his boots. The kitchen was empty, the large oak table standing like a silent altar in the center of the room. This table was where they bowed their heads 3 times a day, where they thanked the Lord for the bounty. But lately, the bounty had been meager, and the prayers had become fervent pleas for rain. Elam stepped out onto the porch, the screen door slapping shut behind him. The smell of the morning was usually sweet with dew and grass, but tis huli. It smelled of dust and dry straw. He walked across the gravel drive toward the barn, the stones crunching beneath his work boots. The silhouette of the barn loomed ahead, a fortress of timber and red paint. Inside the barn, the air was pungent with the scent of animals and hay. The horses, Bess and Buster, shifted in their stalls as he entered. They were good draft horses, strong and patient, but even they seemed lethargic from the days of heat. Elam spoke to them in soft Pennsylvania Dutch, his voice a low rumble in the vast space. "Gutan, Morgan, boys," he whispered. He moved to the cow stalls next. The rhythmic chewing of cud was the only sound. He grabbed a metal pail and a small 3-legged stool, positioning himself beside the first cow. As he began to milk, the pinging of the liquid against the metal bucket established a tempo for the morning. It was a slow, steady beat, the heartbeat of the farm. But as the milk frothed in the bucket, Elam's mind drifted to the bills sitting in the tin box on top of the fridge. The grain bill was higher this year. The veterinary bills for the spring foal had taken a toll, and now, with the drought threatening the harvest, the shadow of debt was growing longer than the shadows in the barn. He finished the milking and carried the heavy pails to the milk house to be cooled. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. It was a beautiful sight, but to a farmer in a drought, a red sky in the morning was a warning. It meant the heat would continue. It meant no clouds. Sarah was in the kitchen when he returned, the smell of frying scrapple and coffee greeting him. She turned from the gas stove, her face framed by her white prayer covering, the cap. Her eyes were kind, but tired. She poured him a mug of coffee, the steam rising in the humidity. "The pump was slow this morning," she said quietly, placing a plate of eggs on the table. Elam took a sip of the black coffee, looking at her hands as she smoothed her apron. "The water table is dropping," he admitted, his voice rough from disuse. "I will check the cistern after breakfast. We may need to haul water for the stock if it gets lower." Sarah nodded, accepting the news with the stoic grace that defined their people. She sat across from him. They bowed their heads for silent prayer. In the quiet, Elam tried to find gratitude. He tried to thank God for the food, for his wife, for the roof over their heads. But his mind kept wandering to the dry creek bed at the edge of the property. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, forcing himself to submit to the will of the Almighty. "Thine will giski, thy will be done." The sun was not yet high, but its power was already absolute. Elam hitched Bess and Buster to the cultivator, the leather harnesses creaking as the horses took the weight. The machinery of the Amish farm was a marvel of engineering and simplicity, designed to work with the earth rather than conquer it. But today, the earth felt like stone. As the horses pulled forward, the metal blades of the cultivator scraped against the hardened soil. Dust puffed up in clouds, coating Elam's boots and trousers in a fine gray powder. Usually, this work was satisfying. The turning of the soil, the smell of fresh earth, the straight lines of the furrow. Today, it felt like a battle against an unyielding enemy. Elam walked behind the horses, the reins loose in his hands. He guided them with voice commands, a language understood perfectly between man and beast. "Gee," he called, and they drifted right. "Ha," and they moved left. But the cornstalks they passed were stunted, their leaves curled tight like clenched fists, trying to hold on to moisture that wasn't there. Cars whizzed by on the county road that bordered his field. Tourists from the city, coming to gawk at the simple life. He could see the glint of sunlight on their windshields, the flash of cameras. They saw a picturesque scene. A man, a horse, a field. They did not see the worry etched into the lines around Elam's eyes. They did not feel the dryness in his throat. He paused at the end of a row to wipe his forehead with a blue handkerchief. The sweat was stinging his eyes. He watched a black SUV slow down, the window rolling down. A woman pointed a phone at him. Elam turned his back, a practiced motion to avoid the photograph. He was not a zoo exhibit. He was a man trying to save his livelihood. He clicked his tongue, and the horses moved again. The labor was repetitive, grueling. His shoulders burned from the tension of holding the plow steady. Every muscle in his body was engaged. This was the curse of Adam to toil by the sweat of his brow. But Elam had always seen it as a blessing, a way to stay close to creation. Today, the blessing felt heavy. By noon, the horses were frothing, their coats dark with sweat. Elam unhitched them, leading them to the water trough near the barn. He pumped the handle, watching the water trickle out. It was slower than usual. He had to pump vigorously for a full minute to fill the trough enough for the thirsty animals. He watched them drink, counting the gallons in his head. Lunch was a quiet affair. Cold ham sandwiches and pickles. The children, little Jonas and Mary, were quiet too, sensing the tension in the house. Jonas, only 6, looked at Elam with wide eyes. "Dead?" he asked. "Will it rain soon?" Elam looked at his son, seeing the innocence that he wanted desperately to protect. "We must have patience." "Jonas?" "God knows the time." After lunch, there was no rest. There were fences to mend. The heat had dried out the wood of the posts. making them brittle. Elam worked with his hammer and staples, the rhythmic banging echoing across the valley. His neighbor, Levi, drove by in his buggy, waving a slow hand. Levi's farm was in the valley floor, where the soil held moisture longer. Elam felt a prick of envy, then immediately repented. Later that afternoon, the community gathered for a quilting bee at the Miller farm down the road. It was not Elam's place to quilt, but the men often gathered in the shop to talk while the women worked. Elam hitched the buggy, and they rode over, the horses' hooves clapping on the asphalt. It was a relief to leave the dry fields for a few hours. In the shop, the men stood around a half-finished wagon, speaking in low tones. They spoke of the weather, of course. It was the only topic that mattered. "The bishop says we must fast next Sunday," Old Man Stoltzfus said, chewing on a piece of straw. "To show our humility." Elam nodded. A fast was appropriate. They needed to show God they were listening. But then the conversation turned to market prices. The price of corn was dropping because the quality was poor across the state. Elam felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had counted on a good price to pay the banknote in October. If the crop failed and the prices fell, he would have nothing. He stayed silent, listening to the older men, looking for wisdom in their weathered faces. Inside the house, Sarah sat with the other women around the large quilting frame. Their needles moved in unison, tiny stitches that bound the layers of fabric together. The quilt was a sunshine and shadow pattern, dark purples and bright yellows. It was a metaphor for their lives. Sarah thought you could not have the pattern without both the light and the dark. She listened to the women talk about their gardens. The tomatoes were splitting from the heat. The cucumbers were bitter. Everyone was suffering, but there was a comfort in the shared burden. No one complained loudly. To complain was to question God's provision. They simply stated the facts, then moved on to news of new babies and upcoming weddings. As they rode home that evening, the sun set in a haze of dust, turning the world a bruised purple. The air cooled slightly, but the ground radiated heat like a dying ember. Elam held the reins, Sarah resting her head on his shoulder. They didn't speak. The clip-clop of the horse and the chirping of crickets were the only sounds in the vast, darkening landscape. 2 weeks passed, and the sky remained a mocking, endless blue. The corn in the south field had turned brown and papery. When the wind blew, it sounded like dry bones rattling together. Elam walked the rows, crumbling a leaf in his hand. It turned to dust instantly. This field was lost. He would have to chop it for silage to feed the cows, but there would be no grain to sell. The crisis hit on a Tuesday. Elam went to the milk house to clean the equipment. He turned the faucet, and nothing came out. A gurgle, a hiss of air, and then silence. He froze. He turned the handle back and forth, panic rising in his chest like bile. He ran to the house, bursting into the kitchen. "Sarah, try the sink." Sarah turned the handle. A thin, brown stream of muddy water sputtered out, then stopped. She looked at him, fear in her eyes. The well had run dry. On a farm with 40 head of cattle and 2 draft horses, water was not a luxury. It was life. Without water, the animals would suffer within hours. The milk production would stop. The farm would die. Elam stood on the porch, his hands trembling. He looked at the sky, searching for a cloud, for mercy. There was none. He had a choice. He could hire a well driller, but that would cost thousands of dollars he didn't have. Or he could ask the neighbors to help haul water, but everyone was low. The humiliation of not being able to provide for his own beasts stung him. A truck pulled into the driveway. It was not a buggy. It was a sleek, silver pickup truck belonging to Mr. Henderson, their English neighbor who owned the large commercial farm down the road. Henderson was a good man, though worldly. He stepped out, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. "Morning, Elam," he called out, walking toward the porch. "Morning, Bob," Elam replied, stepping down to meet him. He tried to hide his worry, but Henderson had a farmer's eye. He saw he saw the dust. "Looks like you're in a tight spot, son," Henderson said gently. "My deep well is holding up fine. I've got a gas-powered pump and some industrial hoses. We could run a line from my creek access to your tank." Elam stiffened. A gas-powered pump. To use an engine to pump water was against the ordering of his church district. They used wind or air pressure or hand pumps. They did not rely on the grid or combustion engines for stationary work. It was a line drawn in the sand to keep them separate from the world, to keep them dependent on God and community, not technology. "I appreciate the offer, Bob," Elam said, his voice steady but strained. "But you know I can't do that." Henderson sighed, taking off his sunglasses. "Elam, it's just water. Your cow's done tea. Know the difference between Amish water and English water. I'm offering to save your herd. Don't let pride get in the way of common sense." Pride. Was it pride, or was it obedience? Elam looked at the thirsty cows gathering near the empty trough. They were lowing softly, a sound of distress. If he accepted the help, he would be breaking the rules of the church. He would have to confess it to the bishop. He might be set back from communion, but if he didn't, his animals might die. "I will find a way, Bob." "Thank you," Elam said, ending the conversation. Henderson shook his head, looking frustrated. "Understands, Elam. Don't wait too long." He got back in his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled on Elam's clean shirt. Elam stood there for a long time, torn between the physical reality of thirst and the spiritual reality of his vows. That night, the house was stifling. Elam could not sleep. He paced the floor of the kitchen. He lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow flame casting long shadows. He opened his German Bible to the Psalms. "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God." He read the words, but his heart felt dry. Where was God? Why was this happening? He went out to the barn again. The cows were restless. He could hear them bumping against the wooden stalls. He grabbed 2 large buckets and walked to the rain barrels by the shed. They were empty. He walked to the creek. It was just mud. He fell to his knees in the dirt, the dampness seeping into his trousers. He felt small. He felt abandoned. "Why?" he whispered into the darkness. "I have kept the faith. I have worked the land. I have raised my children in the fear of the Lord." The silence of the night was his only answer. It was a test of refining fire. But Elam felt like he was burning up, turning to ash, just like his corn. He looked toward Henderson's farm, where an electric yard light glowed steadily, promising ease, promising water. The next morning, the reality set in. Elam hitched the horses to the wagon, loading it with empty plastic tanks. He would have to drive 3 miles to the community spring, a natural source that rarely went dry. It would take hours. He would have to make 4 or 5 trips just to keep the animals alive for one day. It was a grueling, impossible task to maintain. He worked like a man possessed. He drove the wagon, filled the tanks by hand with a bucket, drove back, and emptied them. His back screamed in protest. His hands blistered. The sun beat down on his straw hat, making his head swim. By the 3rd trip, he was dizzy. He stumbled as he lifted a heavy tank, spilling precious water into the dust. He stared at the wet spot on the ground, watching it evaporate in seconds. Rage flared in his chest, a hot, white anger he had rarely felt. He kicked the wagon wheel, shouting a word he never used. Then he stopped, horrified at himself. The heat was stripping away his layers, revealing the raw, ugly nature underneath. He sat on the ground, putting his head in his hands. Sarah came out to the barn when he returned. She saw his exhaustion. She saw the shaking in his hands. She brought him a jar of tea, cool from the cellar. "Elam," she said softly. "The bishop is coming." Elam looked up, startled. "The bishop? Why?" Sarah hesitated. "I sent word to his wife. I told her we were in trouble." Elam felt a flash of betrayal. "You shouldn't have done that. Sarah, I can handle this." Sarah's eyes flashed with a rare steeliness. "You cannot handle this alone, Elam. Look at you. You are breaking. We are a community. We are not meant to bear burdens alone." That is pride talking, not faith. She was right. He knew she was right. Bishop Amos arrived an hour later in his black buggy. He was a stern man with a long gray beard, but his eyes were compassionate. He walked with Elam to the dry well. He looked at the withering corn. He looked at the exhausted horses. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't scold. He simply nodded. "It is a hard season, Elam," he said. "I am tempted," Bishop Elam confessed, looking at his boots. The English neighbor offered a pump. It would be so easy. Bishop Amos put a hand on Elam's shoulder. "Easy's not our way. The easy road leads to the world. We choose the narrow road not because it is paved with gold, but because it leads to God. But the narrow road does not mean you walk it alone." "What do I do?" Elam asked, his voice cracking. "My cattle are thirsty." Bishop Amos smiled slightly. "Tomorrow is Wednesday. We were going to fix the roof on the schoolhouse, but the schoolhouse can wait. Tomorrow, the men will come here. We will dig. We will deepen your well. And until then, my sons are bringing a water tanker from the co-op." Elam felt the tension in his chest snap. Tears pricked his eyes, embarrassing him. He wiped them away quickly with his sleeve. "Thank you," Bishop Amos nodded. "Do not thank me. Thank the Lord who provides the brethren." That night, for the first time in weeks, Elam slept. The problem wasn't solved, but the isolation was gone. The next morning, the mist had not yet lifted when the buggies began to arrive. One by one, they turned into the lane, black carriages emerging from the gray dawn like a ghostly procession. Men in denim trousers and broad-brimmed hats jumped down, carrying shovels, picks, and ropes. There were young boys, strong and eager, and old men with hands like gnarled roots. There was very little talking. They knew what to do. It was a frolic, a work party, but serious in its nature. They set up a tripod over the existing well shaft. A pulley system was rigged. One man was lowered down into the dark, damp hole to dig out the mud and rock, filling buckets that were hauled up by the men above. Elam worked alongside them, his fatigue forgotten. The sound of metal striking rock, the creak of the rope, the grunts of exertion, it was a symphony of brotherhood. They took turns in the hole, digging deeper into the earth, searching for the vein of water that they knew was there. It was dangerous, claustrophobic work, but no one complained. By noon, the women had arrived. Sarah and the neighbor wives set up tables on the lawn under the shade of the maple trees. They brought mountains of food casseroles, homemade bread, pickled beets, chu chow, and choufle pie. The smell of the food mixed with the sweat and the dirt. They paused to eat, standing in groups, laughing now. The burden was shared, and in sharing, it became light. "We hit clay at 40 feet, Levi said, biting into a sandwich. "That's a good sign." "The water is under the clay." Elam nodded, feeling a surge of hope. They went back to work with renewed energy. The sun was high and fierce, but 20 men can do in an hour what one man cannot do in a week. They were an army of simplicity, fighting the drought with muscle and will. At 3 o'clock, a shout came from the bottom of the well. "Water. It's coming in fast." The men on the rope pulled quickly, hauling young Jonas Miller up from the shaft. He was covered in mud, grinning, his boots dripping. "It's a good vein, Elam, cold and clear." A cheer went up, not loud or raucous, but a deep, satisfied rumble from the men. They watched as the water level began to rise in the shaft. It wasn't a geyser. It wasn't a flood. It was a steady, rising seep. Life returning to the farm. Elam pumped the handle of the windmill. At first, air. Then brown sludge. Then, finally, a clear, steady stream of water splashed into the trough. The cows, sensing the change, began to move toward it. Elam stood back, watching the water flow. He felt a hand on his back. It was Henderson. The English neighbor. He had stopped his truck on the road to watch. He walked up to the fence. "You boys are something else," Henderson said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I would have had a rig here in an hour." "You took all day." "We took all day," Elam agreed, "but we did it together. And we owe the bank nothing for it." Henderson laughed, a genuine sound of respect. "Well, I can't argue with that. Glad you got your water." Elam... He tipped his cap and walked away. Elam realized then that he didn't envy Henderson anymore. The pump would have been faster, yes, but it would have been lonely. The men began to pack up their tools. The women cleared the tables. The buggies began to leave. The horses refreshed from the water in the trough. Elam stood by the gate, shaking hands. "Danke," he said to each of them. It was a small word, but it held everything. That evening, the clouds finally began to gather. They were heavy, dark purple clouds, bruising the western sky. The wind picked up, turning the leaves of the trees inside out, showing their silver undersides. It was the smell of rain, that distinct metallic scent of ozone and wet dust. Elam and Sarah sat on the porch swing. The air cooled rapidly. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the fields. The corn was damaged. Yes. The harvest would be small this year. There would be no extra money for new buggies or additions to the house. They would have to be thrifty. They would have to patch and mend. But as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the tin roof with a sound like applause, Elam felt a profound sense of peace. He reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her hand was rough from work, warm and strong. They watched the rain intensify, blurring the line between the earth and the sky. "The Lord provides," Sarah whispered. "He provides," Elam answered, "sometimes with rain, sometimes with neighbors." He looked out at his farm. It was a hard life. It was a life of denial, of labor, of separation. The world out there offered ease. It offered comfort at the flip of a switch, but it didn't offer this. It didn't offer the deep, bone-settling knowledge that you are never alone. It didn't offer the quiet victory of endurance. The rain fell harder, washing the dust from the windowsills, turning the gray fields black with moisture. The well was full. The children were asleep. The debt would be paid. Somehow, Elam closed his eyes, listening to the music of the storm, grateful for the simple, difficult, beautiful life he had been given.